thanks to all of you for joining us today and taking time out of your busy schedules to sit in the classroom and listen to a talk that none of you have to be here for. I think a lot of you are either students or professors and spend a lot of times in your time in classrooms, either giving or listening to talks. And so we're really happy that you've joined us here today when you've got so much else going on. And my name's Matt Buffton. I am the executive director of a group called the Institute for Liberal Studies. We're an educational nonprofit based in Ottawa. We are not affiliated with any universities, but we do programming designed for university students, in particular, exploring ideas in classical liberalism. We're a nonpartisan group. I used to say that we are Adam Smith liberals, not Justin Trudeau liberals, but I'm going to need to get a new joke in a few months. We really like to explore classical liberal themes in politics, philosophy, economics, but also other fields adjacent to that, such as law and history. And increasingly over the last few years, tried to put an emphasis on our programs in ideas around freedom of speech, toleration, both legal and societal values that encourage people to come together, to have conversations, to have that sort of back and forth of ideas. One thing I think we do in our programs is give students a space where you can have conversations and talk to other people who may disagree and practice that sort of exercise in civil discourse. So for the students in the room, I will quickly put in a plug for our Freedom Week seminar, which is taking place at McGill University this year from August 10th to 16th. That's a week-long seminar with about 5 professors and about 50 students. We get together, we have conversations about classical liberalism, about the foundations of a free society, about economic and civil freedoms. I'm very happy to say that we are able to do that completely free of charge for students. So we cover accommodations and meals and everything at McGill in Montreal for that week. We don't pay travel, so you do have to cover that. Details of that will be posted on our website soon. It's a competitive application process. We ask you to tell you a little bit about yourself and why you want to come. So if you enjoyed today's event, I hope you'll take a look at our Freedom Week seminar when those details are announced and consider applying for that as a student. I know we have a number of professors here, so I'll say if any of you are looking for guest speakers dealing with things like sort of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, a tolerant society, and all that good stuff, if you're interested in reaching out to me, we also have programs to support speakers and events for professors who are looking to discuss those sorts of themes. Very happy to be working here today with both Heterodox Academy. I know a number of you are part of either the Toronto or McMaster chapters of Heterodox Academy, and also a group called Voices for Liberty, based at George Mason University of the Law School down in Virginia, but with a sort of, not just American, but international interest in encouraging voices about liberty, talking about free speech, but especially in the context of civil rights and social progress, which is an area that I think it probably does not quite get enough attention. So very happy to have both those groups partnering with us today. We are going to do our event in sort of a dual format. The first about half of it will be Scott Davies in conversation with Nadine Strossen. He has some questions, so we'll be posing to her and they'll be back and forth. And then we do want to make sure we leave ample time near the end for any of you who have questions or comments to have that sort of discussion. I know this is a topic obviously you're interested in because you've taken the time to be here today. Scott Davies here is a sociologist by training, now teaching in the Ontario Centre for Education here at the University of Toronto. And Nadine Strossen is now Emerita professor of law at New York Law School, former president of the American Civil Liberties Union. It's a great pleasure to welcome both of them for what I think will be a really interesting and important conversation.
Thanks, Matt. Just before I start interviewing Nadine, maybe just a plug for Heterodox Academy. If you haven't heard of us, we're an organization that was founded by Jonathan Haidt some years back with a number of chapters throughout North America. I'm co-chair of the University of Toronto chapter with Stephen Reish, who's over there, our other co-chair. And what our organization is all about is trying to promote more viewpoint diversity on campus, but principled by these sorts of goals here: to make our case with evidence, to be intellectually charitable, to be intellectually humble and constructive, but yet authentic in ourselves. And I know the university here is committed to more civil discourse, and we're hoping to promote and help promote that goal for the university. For anyone who's interested in getting to know more about Heterodox Academy, feel free to reach out to myself, scott.davies@utoronto.ca, or Dylan Gold, who's also a member at large. So write down those emails and shoot us a note if you want to get more involved or at least find out about us. We also have some merch here at the front door, our buttons and so forth. So on your way out, feel free to grab anything. So, okay, so Nadine, why don't we start talking about some of these issues around free speech? I thought maybe we'd start off with just very general principles. So people have been talking about free speech for centuries and the restrictions on it, and then academic freedom for decades and restrictions on it across a whole lot of contexts, incredibly changing circumstances. So for you, what do you think core principles can withstand these different times and different places?
Thank you so much, Scott. And before I answer that excellent question, by the way, we didn't rehearse this, so this is completely spontaneous. I have no idea what I was going to be asked, and I look forward to that. But before answering, I want to thank you and Matt and Stephen, everybody who's been responsible for organizing this event, and especially to those of you who have taken your precious time to come. These are such important issues, and that's a good segue into answering your question. And I am truly, truly grateful to all of you who are interested and committed to promote a freedom which is not going to exist in reality unless people are aware of it and support it and exercise it. And let me just put my own personal answer, Scott, in a broader context, because I am so used to hearing accusations of American exceptionalism. And by the way, I've always bristled at the word American as referring to the United States, because I think of Canadians as also being Americans, but that's the way the term is used, for better or worse. And so those of us who defend free speech on the other side of the border here are always accused of being exceptionalists, absolutists, ridiculous, extremists. We're separated from the rest of the world, including you nice, moderate people on this side of the border. And the truth of the matter is, if you look at history, if you look at controversies and discussions about free speech around the world throughout history, there have been perennial commonalities. There have always been individuals who have had an innate sense of the importance of speech as a means of self-expression, as a means of communication, as a means of exploration for the discovery of truth, for the pursuit of democracy in a political system. And let me say that I'm channeling an outstanding book that was written by a colleague of mine, Jakob Michangama. He's Danish. He founded a think tank in Denmark many years ago, but a few years ago, he moved to the United States to continue his work under the auspices of something called the Future of Free Speech. It's based at Vanderbilt University. And based on copious research, he did an amazing book in 2018 called A Global History of Free Speech from Socrates to Social Media. And what's so interesting is in every part of the world, in every type of political system, with every kind of ethnic or religious, other demographic factors, there has always been a strong push for free speech and a strong counter push to rein it in. So I speak as a citizen of the world all time when I think I already answered the question in terms of the many values of free speech. In the United States, I think the best summary came from Justice Louis Brandeis in a famous, what was essentially dissenting opinion in 1927, but in 1969 was unanimously embraced by the United States Supreme Court as a majority opinion and has been endorsed by every justice since then across the ideological spectrum. And he basically said freedom of speech has both an intrinsic value to help each of us explore our own identities, to discover who we are, what we believe, how we want to express that to ourselves, and an instrumental value, instrumental for pursuing not only truth in every possible sense, philosophical, religious, scientific, absolutely essential for democratic self-government. We, the people, to quote the opening words of our Constitution, wield sovereign power. How can we do that unless we can robustly debate and discuss those who are seeking power, seeking to represent us? And then let me come back to the theme of Voices for Liberty, with which I'm also a senior fellow. As a lifelong human rights activist, I am absolutely convinced that the most essential prerequisite for any human right, whether it's racial justice or gender justice or any other, privacy, fairness, due process, all depends on robust freedom of speech. The freedom of speech that is robust enough that it will extend to the most controversial, hated ideas.
Okay, so
Is that all?
yeah. The title for today that we chose was "Should Free Speech Ever Be Limited in the Universities?" What's your take?
Oh, and I think you probably had asked me to talk about the scope of free speech. One of the other canards about First Amendment law in the United States, and I'll use that as a shorthand, but again, I do want to put it in an international perspective, because most of the principles, the core principles of First Amendment law, are replicated in the laws, including the constitutional law, of many other countries, and are also very closely paralleled in the only truly international law of free speech, and that is under major United Nations treaties. This is not nearly as well known as it should be. There's language in those treaties that strikes, dissonance from free speech perspectives. But if you look at interpretations that have been given by key officials and bodies at the United Nations, there's a very strong speech protective theme that mirrors the major principles of First Amendment law. So if anybody wants to ask about the details of that, please feel free to do so. For now, I'll put it aside. But I want you to know that everything that I say is not specifically focused on this carpetbagging, person from the United States as trying to peddle First Amendment principles around the world. No, there is support for those principles. I need not tell you that people are dying in other countries, right? People are putting their lives on the line for these principles. So fortunately, we have not yet come to that in either of our countries. But so one of the canards about vigorous free speech principles is that, oh, you free speech supporters are absolutists, and you will never acknowledge that there are any limits on free speech whatsoever. And in fact, you don't even admit that speech can do harm. No, no, no. Those who attack free speech are really attacking this caricatured, distorted version of it. The more you know about free speech law, the more it accords with common sense. So again, using the First Amendment law as an example here, the government has the power to restrict the speech that is the most dangerous. That's consistent with something that is usually called the emergency principle, and it traces back to that famous landmark Brandeis opinion that I mentioned earlier. That speech that directly causes or imminently threatens certain specific serious harm can and should be restricted. And the Supreme Court has recognized multiple examples of this, and this is a context-defined concept, right? And before I give you some examples of speech that can be restricted and should be restricted, consistent with the emergency principle, let me tell you what the other core principle is, and that is the principle that prevents government from engaging in the speech restrictions that are the most dangerous. And they are the most dangerous because they are viewpoint based. Government is picking and choosing the ideas, the messages that are unpopular or disfavored or even hateful or hated. And the cardinal viewpoint neutrality principle says government may never restrict speech solely because of disagreement with its viewpoint. That is the most dangerous form of censorship because it is the government deciding what ideas are positive and worthy of hearing and which are not, which speakers are deserving of hearing and which are not. And that is completely antithetical to individual liberty, to equality, and to democratic self-government alone. So the content neutrality or viewpoint neutrality principle is really important. There should be no exceptions to it. But if you move beyond the content or the viewpoint of the message, and you look at it in its overall context, if in the particular facts and circumstances, the expression, as I said, directly causes or imminently threatens specific harm, and it's not harm such as, I dislike your idea and I feel offended, and I don't mean to trivialize that. I know that words can indeed wound, but it's much more harmful to empower government to pick and choose which hurtful words should be subject to restriction. But if you're talking about, targeted harassment or bullying, targeted true threats that intentionally put the target in reasonable fear that they're going to be subject to attack, those are a few examples that satisfy the emergency concept.
You mentioned in your latest book on free speech that you looked at Canada's hate speech laws. So what's your take on them as restrictors of speech?
In 2018, I wrote an entire book called Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. And again, that ties in with my theme and VFL Live's theme. In that entire title, the only verb is resist. My overarching goal is resisting, reducing, minimizing hatred, discrimination, intolerance. And I oppose censoring hate speech. More importantly, human rights activists around the world, whom I quote in my book, oppose censoring hate speech, putting aside the free speech concerns, but an independently sufficient reason for the opposition is no matter how well intended those laws are, they are at best ineffective and at worst counterproductive. And there are a lot of examples from Canada. I had like a stack of pages that I had Xeroxed from that book that I left in my hotel room, but I reviewed them as I was waiting in the airport for 5 hours this morning. Do you know that how many flights were delayed? And, I'm not sure how familiar all of you are with the history in this country. I gather that there has not been very much enforcement recently, in part because of an acknowledgement that this is not an effective way to accomplish the very worthy goal. This should go without saying, but I will say it. Of course, I support the goal of promoting equality, reducing discrimination, prohibiting and outlawing discriminatory conduct and certainly discriminatory violence, and promoting the wonderful goals of harmony and inclusivity that I associate very much with Canada. But some of the cases were really quite astounding. One of the first cases in this country involved a school teacher, I think in Western Canada.
Sure.
Yes, so you're familiar with that. And the litigation went on. He said he was definitely violating academic freedom responsibilities. I'm looking at our assistant provost here, who was an expert on academic freedom, by using the classroom to indoctrinate students in anti-Semitic hatred, and he was, justified in being removed from teaching. After that, he was subject to prosecution under the federal criminal hate speech statute. And I think he had something like 3 trials and retrials over the course of something like 14 years. He ended up finally getting what one commentator called a slap on the wrist in terms like 1 year parole and 1 year probation. And and I think he had a brief prison term, but even from within prison, he was still blogging to the outside world somehow or communicating. So there was absolutely no, and millions of dollars were spent on this. On the other hand, so it's not an effective way to suppress somebody's attitude. We've got some sociology experts here, and I think social scientists say that, if you want to reduce attention to a message, it's often counterproductive to pursue it, to put it on trial, that it draws attention to try to suppress it. And so it has exactly the opposite amplifying effect, the opposite of the minimizing effect that you want to have. And then there are counterexamples of all kinds of important speech about issues of great public policy concern that are subject to suppression as hate speech. And I know there are examples that I read about on our side of the border. A comic most recently was one case, and
that was in the UK, wasn't it?
no, there was one in Canada as well.
Yeah. I was going to say that they would call that the Streisand effect, where
Yeah.
by trying to ban something, you draw more attention to it. And there were several cases in the 80s and 90s, like Keekstra and others in Canada that got payments for that. So maybe moving towards issues of heterodoxy, which is a cousin of free speech issues. Surveys that Heterodox did in Canada recently show that alarmingly large numbers of students expressed concerns that if they spoke out on controversial issues, A, their professors might sanction them, and B, their peers would. And then as well, I think it's more in the U.S. that you see these surveys, but that the professoriates, politics and ideologies are quite skewed. They don't look like the general public. So what, if anything, should be done about those things?
Yeah, I just I reread the Heterodox survey that was done of Canada, and I've been reading those surveys that have been done by Heterodox Academy and College Pulse, which was also involved in the Canada survey, and FIRE and Pew and many other sources. And the results are very consistent that first of all, that a majority or at least a strong plurality of people on all campuses of all political persuasions do not dare to address certain topics, let alone certain perspectives, that there are certain topics that they simply do not feel comfortable talking about in class, in the cafeteria, or in conversations with fellow students or conversations with faculty members. In the United States, I think our survey was a little bit more detailed in terms of specific subjects. And the number one subject that is now taboo on college campuses in the United States is abortion, where you may know we have huge public policy debates going on. Abortion has been denied as a federal constitutional right by the Supreme Court a couple of years ago. And even recently, a doctor in New York, my home state, is being prosecuted by another state. I want to say Texas, but I'm not positive, a state that has outlawed abortion, but she's being prosecuted for having written a prescription for somebody in that other state for medically induced abortion. So it's a huge issue. And the idea that faculty and students would not feel comfortable talking about it. And in Canada, the main topics were where people were self-censoring, were anything to do with the Middle East, which is also a big taboo in the United States. Immigration, another,
Trans was,
yeah, of course, LGBTQ issues. I mean, these are the most important issues where we should have the most robust and open debates of all places on college campuses. There was, to me, one striking difference, Scott, between the major source of self-censorship reported in the United States and in Canada, which is in the United States, students and faculty members were not afraid of being punished by the government. That may be changing, but as of last year, that was not the source of fear. And students and faculty members were not afraid of any kind of retaliation by university officials or administrators. They were afraid of their peers. Students were afraid of students. Faculty members were afraid of students and of other faculty members. And in Canada, the results to me were quite surprisingly different. And by the way, I should say that the Canadian study was not, what's the term that you social scientists use? It was not a statistically valid sample. That was acknowledged.
Not a random sample.
Not a random sample. So I don't know if that makes it even worth talking about. It seemed very interesting, but with that disclaimer, it did include a lot of different campuses and a lot of different respondents. And the major source of self-censorship, the major fear here was coming from above, that you would be subject to discipline by a university administrator. There seemed to be less peer-to-peer fear than there is in the United States, which is very interesting because, we Americans, I'm just thinking aloud here, we Americans often pride ourselves on having such strong, much more long-lasting than you have had, a protection for individual rights against government restriction. And yet, as a practical matter, the suppressive impact is exactly the same, if not worse, when it's coming from non-governmental sources. For those of you who haven't recently reread John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, I commend to you that entire brilliant essay, which I consider still the greatest explanation of the importance of individual liberty, it's all about peer pressure and social pressure. He says right at the beginning, I'm not writing this about government restrictions. I think that social pressure can have an even more pervasive, even more chilling impact. And so that gets to it's a way around once we've diagnosed what the problem is, what do we do about it? Obviously, on your side of the border, it's maybe a little bit easier because if it's the administrators that are causing the fear, then hopefully a change in administrative policies and practices will solve that problem. And so having administrators or university leaders adopt something like the Chicago Free Speech Principles or the American Association of University Professors. Again, I'm not sure, does the word American there extend to Canada too? I would hope so. Or is there a Canadian Association of University Professors and Academic Freedom organization?
Yeah, but a lot of us here actually interact with American universities a lot. We go to the conferences. Our colleagues are from the U.S.
No, I feel as if we're part of the same community, but I don't like using the word that makes it sound like I'm only talking about the United States. I'm looking for, I use American inclusively, but I know not everybody does. So if your universities could adopt those academic freedom principles, institutional neutrality is something that's gotten a lot of momentum in the United States, which I think is really protective of academic freedom. So those kinds of administrative and policy protections seem as if they would go a long way toward correcting the issues that surfaced in the Canadian report. As for peer pressure, which is a problem here too, although apparently not to the same extent as in the US, that's something that I really can't do anything about. When students are, I'm not your peer, I wish I were. Well, sort of. So you can do it. That's why I say those of you who are here from the faculty and student body, you are so essential because the cultural change the cultural improvement has to come from you. And of course, those of us who are in different positions can be supportive. Maybe we can be role models. Maybe we can be mentors. But there has to be a grassroots movement as well as a grass tops movement.
And that's very much a heterodox mission about changing the culture or having influence as opposed to policy. Very much.
Yes,
Yeah.
very much. The founding, and I'm on the advisory council of Heterodox, and I think it's a fantastic organization, which does not have free speech as its mission. Free speech is kind of one of the incidental byproducts and or a necessary engine for promoting the values of the Heterodox Academy. But I think it's really interesting to go into the origin story. Jonathan Haidt and a number of other social psychologists did studies that demonstrated that their research results were degraded and not subject to and not as valid precisely because of the lack of viewpoint diversity, which in their departments and in departments generally around the United States or around the world. And that led to a lack of a reduction in the vigor and robustness of the criticism that these papers or theories were subject to. And just for the purpose of more effectively pursuing truth in their social scientific research and writing, they started to advocate these principles, including viewpoint diversity and heterodox perspectives. And then, of course, free speech is interwoven. Since I have alluded to my hero, John Stuart Mill, I have to bring out my favorite prop. And I don't, it's not what everybody suspects, but... Can you read what it says?
Make IS Mill. Oh, JS Mill.
Make S Mill great again. I just not go. Hopefully, I only have a few more years for people to laugh at that.
Yeah.
Well, that was a nonpartisan statement. Seriously, I wouldn't want anybody to be able to run for a third term. So
Make it blue and red next time, the cap. So okay, so moving to contemporary challenges, like topics, campus protests. So as we all know, the past year has been a lot of protests on campus, encampments. We have one just around the corner here. The protesters themselves felt very strong that they had the right to do that, to the protests, while others felt equally strong. They felt intimidated by the protests. Their freedom of movement was restricted. So what would be your take on those protests?
this goes back to those fundamental free speech principles that viewpoint may never be punished, no matter how offensive or controversial it might be. But if the expression is causing some kind of demonstrable harm other than dislike of its viewpoint, such as disruption of the campus educational mission, then it can and should be restricted. And one kind of restriction that is consistent with that core viewpoint neutrality principle are viewpoint neutral time, place, and manner restrictions. So you may not say anything, no matter what your perspective is, pro-Israel, anti-Israel, so forth, if you are doing it in a way that prevents the university from fulfilling its educational mission. And whether that be from physically disrupting access to certain classrooms or libraries, as has happened on campuses at the United States. Also, the expression can constitute one of those types of subcategories of expression that satisfy the emergency principle. And here, I was actually going to use this as an example, and then we moved on to something else, so I'm glad we came back to it. Just the day before yesterday, we had a major decision from a federal district court in the United States assessing a complaint of anti-Semitic harassment against Cooper Union, a private university in New York. And that particular federal statute, I'll tell you about, but that's really beside the point because we're talking about free speech principles that would exist even apart from the federal statute. But this is a little bit wonky. Yeah, I think I'm going to edit out the wonk. If you have follow-up questions, you can ask me. But the question was whether certain conduct, including expressive conduct, could be punished as hostile environment harassment that was undermining the equal or violating the equal right of Jewish students and Israeli students to have access to educational programs and activities. And it was a very, very long decision. These issues, as I've already indicated, are very fact specific. We've got the general principles, right? We can agree on those, but you have to apply them in the context of a very complicated factual record. And so you get these complaints that are hundreds of pages long, well, dozens and dozens of pages long. The decision was more than 100 pages. And I think by and large, the judge got it right. He said, first of all, that no matter how offensive the expression might be, whether you consider it to be anti-Semitic, whether you consider it to be advocacy of genocide, doesn't matter. You have the right to engage in anti-Semitic expression to convey anti-Semitic pro-genocide ideas. If you're speaking to a general audience, such as from a demonstration, including an encampment on campus. But if you are targeting a particular individual or a small group of individuals by chanting certain messages in a menacing manner, approaching too close to them, stalking them, making them run a gauntlet through these chants in order to get access to a facility. In this case, it was the library. That crosses the line into constitutionally unprotected and statutorily unprotected targeted harassment or intimidation. And so the judge said some of the allegations were not a basis for the action, but many of them unfortunately were. And let me just say that I'm sorry I don't have the opinion with me because the Cooper Union actually argued. So the major incident, you may have read about it, was shortly after October 7th. A group of Jewish students were huddled in the library as they were being approached by some, pro-Palestinian demonstrators who were shouting and, banging, making a lot of noise. And the Jewish students inside the library clearly were terrified. The librarian locked the library doors so they couldn't get in. The demonstrators could not get in, and told the Jewish students that there was an upstairs attic room that was hidden where they should go and hide. And that was actually an argument that Cooper Union made. I get chills as I think about this, and said that they were not responsible for not having taken enough action to protect the Jewish students from harassment. It was the Jewish students' own fault because they refused to go upstairs and hide in the closet. And I'm getting chills because the judge actually said, this is 2025. It is not 1943.
Frank. Yeah. Final question before we go to the audience. Another light topic about DEI, or whatever the acronym is this month. Is it compatible, DEI policies at universities, with academic freedom and free speech? And conversely, this is a two-part question, are attempts to roll back DEI that we're seeing now, are they also breaches of free speech?
Yeah, thank you so much, Scott. And I just, in the interest of really underscoring viewpoint neutrality, I want to say this case happened to involve that I just talked about happen to involve allegations of anti-Semitic harassment. There are other cases that involve allegations of anti-Palestinian, anti-Islam harassment, and those would raise similar issues. And I have to say, right after October 7th, I was contacted by Barry Weiss, who's the publisher of the Free Press and very strong crusader against anti-Semitism, also a very strong crusader for free speech. And she said, Nadine, somebody has to write an essay about why even anti-Semites deserve free speech, and you have to do it. And I did. And I also believe that there is a distinction between critiquing policies of the Israeli government and even critiquing Zionism and anti-Semitism. So the examples that I gave, I just want to be clear, I'm completely aware that there's a lot of other legitimate, not only should be constitutionally protected, but an important part of the dialogue. Now, so the devil really is in the details. The problem with so let me start again with, I hope that this would go without saying, but unfortunately it doesn't. I can't think of more universally appealing goals, speaking for myself personally and what I understand of the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in the United States, than diversity and equity and inclusion, right? If we mean them in the embracing sense of which I understand them to be as aspirations, no matter who you are and no matter what you believe, solely by virtue of your humanity, you are entitled to full and equal human dignity and human rights. To me, that is the whole philosophy of the American system of government. Those are aspirations that were set out in the Declaration of Independence. Obviously, we're light years away from actually living up to them. But I think as aspirations, they remain the lodestar. However, programs that masqueraded under the name of serving those fundamental principles, actually, there's a lot of evidence that many of them have done exactly the opposite, that they have fostered division and discrimination and inequality. And, I'm sure I don't know if this has been going on your side of the border as much, but there have been a lot of studies that have shown that a common approach at all levels of education, including K through 12, is to oversimplify, to treat all of us not as individuals, but to put us into binary categories, looking at only one aspect of our identity. And we are either oppressors or we are victims. We are not full-fledged individual human beings. And so, under the name of those goals, they have been subverted. And here I was talking to Stephen about empirical research, including by Musa Al-Gharbi, who's very closely involved with Heterodox Academy. He has done, and others have done, meta studies of the actual impact of DEI programs, showing that they are at best completely ineffective, at worst counterproductive. That making people who have been in traditionally discriminated against groups, feel even more victimized and disempowered, and that they've heightened divisiveness and resentment on the basis of demographic characterizations. That said, Donald Trump's executive orders, it's almost impossible to keep up with all of them. But it's substituting one form of divisiveness and indoctrination prescribed by the government for another one. And he did this in an executive order in his first administration, which was then replicated in state statutes all around the United States, basically prohibiting any discussion of these topics at all, prohibiting any discussion of critical race theory. And that has led to purging of curricula, including at the university level, of a faculty reasonably fearful of falling afoul of the administration and losing federal funding, which is a huge source of, universities in the United States are dependent on it, private universities as well as public universities. So understandably, they bend over backwards to avoid falling under the sweep of these very subjectively written, overbroad injunctions. And I would say a pox on both your houses that we, all faculty members consistent with academic freedom principles and all students consistent with free speech principles should be free to debate and discuss what do we mean by those important concepts and how can, what is the history of race in this country, and without being either proscribed to think a certain way, as has often been happening, or prescribed to think in a certain way, or proscribed that you may not talk about it in a certain way.
Okay, well, I've asked a series of questions, and we want to go to the audience now, and I can come up with the microphone. So anyone have questions for Nadine?
Or comments? Absolutely.
Okay, Jack.
Thanks. A great deal of activity at research universities in the social sciences as well as the natural sciences, if it is federally funded, and even in some cases if it is not, must be approved by an ethics review board. In the US, they're called IRBs. In Canada, they're called REBs, but they work pretty much the same way. And I believe that these were probably, I sit on one in the interest of disclosure that reviews oncology trials, where we are mainly concerned with ensuring that human research participants in drug trials are not exposed to undue risk or are not being misled into participation. But it seems that the way that they operate, or at least there has been a push to include considerations like whether research findings will undermine people's sacred myths, whether they will lead to policy outcomes that are deemed objectionable, whether the research will be potentially stigmatizing to certain populations within society. I was wondering if you would hold that these two principles you articulated of viewpoint neutrality and emergency exceptions only should apply to ethics review of studies in universities.
Yes, I think the answer is yes, but I would say even more directly concepts of academic freedom, which is what we're talking about, right? We're talking about scholarly research, and the idea of academic freedom as propounded originally in 1959 by the AAUP and reaffirmed many, many times after that but it came from, as you probably know, German universities in the 19th century, which were research universities when we were just finishing schools and theological institutes in the United States. So, but when we began to establish serious research functions at our universities, the AAUP insisted, with support from university administrators, that there should be absolute freedom in pursuit of research and in the defining what your topic of research would be and what methodology you would use, and in disseminating the fruits of your research, that you should not be through teaching or through publication, and you should not be subject to any limitations from either university officials or government officials. Rather, you are subject, as you know, only to the constraints that are imposed by your professional peers to conduct your research consistent with the established norms of that specific discipline. And I understand, some people have said to me, well, that gives a great deal of latitude, doesn't it? Suppose your discipline has sort of been hijacked by people with a certain viewpoint. Does that mean that they could say that you terminate or chill your academic freedom to pursue a different perspective. And that's where I think the viewpoint neutrality principle would come in. That if you could say that, let me use my discipline of law as an example. I really don't know very much about social science other than articles I read on the Heterodox Academy website and so forth. But in the discipline of law, I would say that there are a lot of very robust disagreements about what the appropriate methodology for interpreting and enforcing the United States Constitution should be. Some people are real devotees of originalism, some are of textualism, some are what we call the living Constitution. And I would say that, as long as there is some substantial support for any of those methodologies, that it would be a violation of academic freedom for a dean or a review board to say you may not pursue research according to one of those approaches, or you must pursue research that is going to result in some societal benefit. Well, what do you think? I'd love to hear, since you're an expert.
Oh, I just agree with you. I mean, I'm in the field of biomedical ethics. There are similar constitutional interpretation within that.
Yes. There are multiple approaches, and I think that we need to be concerned about that
Physical battery of patients in the context in which I work, but there's a danger of these mechanism be co-opted in order to enforce a kind of ideological order.
And I think we have to have real historical humility, because there have been times in United States history when the most learned people believed in eugenics, right? And that would have been consistent with their ethics, that it's for the good of society that we engage in sterilization of certain people. And I know we would say, oh, but we would never do that. But I think we have to have historical humility that a future generation is going to look back on what we take for granted as so clearly correct that it is not subject to debate about whether it's ethical.
I had a question regarding social media, especially because it's a very important tool for people my age, and we use it as our main source of news nowadays.
Are you using TikTok?
Yes, I am. In your opinion, does social media allow a greater, is it used as a platform that allows freedom of speech, or does it instead create echo chambers where one certain perspective is presented and everything else is shut down, or individuals are attacked, especially knowing about the presence of cancel culture? And more than that, what tools or resources do you think we can use to increase the amount of freedom of speech we have in social media?
I don't know how much time we have, so I'm not good. Well, that too, but in my ideal forum, this is wonderful, but we don't have enough time to do what I would ideally like to do, which is to ask you what you think. In the United States, we've gone back and forth on TikTok being banned. I can't keep track. I think Donald Trump's latest is he wants it to still be allowed in the United States, but that could change. And I was recently doing a seminar about this, just on the TikTok issue, for a lot of non-students, let's put it that way. And I had invited one undergraduate friend of mine, and she looked at, this was mostly retired people because it was in the middle of the day. And she, after listening to this debate for about 90 minutes, she looked at us and she said, forgive me, but how many of you have ever used TikTok? Of course, not a single hand went off. I'm sure that's true for the United States Supreme Court, which recently issued a decision here. But this goes back to the original question that Scott asked me. The issues are exactly the same as they've been for all media throughout history. Every time a new medium has been invented, and I'm old enough that I've lived through several of them. I remember, when I was a kid, comic books were fairly new, and there was a huge uproar in the United States about how dangerous comic books were, and a big push to censor them. They were censored, and television was just spreading to homes around the country, and there was big concern about the danger of TV to kids, and then later cable TV, and of course the internet itself, video games. All of these have been subject, but then going back further, the printing press is a great example, but the invention of paper is another example. The invention of the radio, the invention of telephone, every single one, the dangers are always the same. Young people are going to be prey, and ignorant, uneducated people are going to be prey to disinformation and hateful speech and whatever in the society at that particular time considers to be the greatest danger. They are concerned that the new communications medium will be used to perpetuate that danger. But these are mediums of communication. They transmit whatever ideas or information, bad or good or indifferent, that we human beings use them for. And there is something about a tendency to emphasize the negative. You know, in the old media that was called, if it bleeds, it leads. So I think there's been a disproportionate attention to the potential dangers of information or misinformation being transmitted online. And especially for those of you who are fortunate enough to have grown up with this wonderful opportunity for unparalleled, unprecedented access to information and ideas and communication, you take for granted the fact that every person in the world can potentially communicate with every other person in the world. Yes, you can get access to a lot more disinformation, but it's so much easier to do your own fact checking, to look at the original sources, to find out who are the respected experts, to immediately find out what their views are. And to give you very concrete examples, in the United States, the very first political campaign to use social media was Barack Obama. And think about that, an African-American person being elected president of the United States, you know, many years ago now. I never thought I'd see that in my lifetime. And a lot of credit was given to this then unprecedented harnessing of this powerful new communications medium, not only for getting out information, but for mobilizing people. I've, since the 1980s, the ACLU had been working so hard against discrimination against Black people in the criminal justice system, criminal injustice system, and trying very, very hard to draw attention and reform. And none of that got traction until, and in fact, the Black Lives Matter movement had started earlier, but it never got traction until the advent of social media that made it much easier to recruit people and to spread the message. Same thing with the movement against sexual harassment and sexual violence. That had existed forever, but the Me Too movement took off in an unprecedentedly effective way because of the power of social media. So we all have a responsibility to use these tools, you know, to be aware of the pitfalls, to engage in critical information and media literacy skills, to make the best use of it, to avoid the pitfalls, and to maximize the benefits.
I'm not sure how to frame my question, but I think there's an American scholar who says that the digital platforms are to the First Amendment what an AR-15 is to the Second Amendment, because the original laws, the Constitution was conceived with muzzle-loading rifles. It cannot imagine something that can fire 100 bullets in 15 seconds. And a lot of what you've described here is based on slower rhythms of publication, newspapers, television stations. The speed and the scale at which digital platforms communicate has, I think, invited in an enormous quantity of bad faith communication, which is not covered by your arguments. And if you look at Andrew Marantz's book on social media, he talks a lot about people trying to open the Overton window, in which case you're not trying to actually prevail in an argument. You're trying to poison the discourse. And when you have unregulated platforms at scale poisoning the discourse. Aren't these arguments somewhat peripheral and well-intentioned though they may be? Aren't these yesterday's solutions to today's problems?
Well, I respectfully disagree, and I've read the book, and I don't know who made this statement that you quoted. It could have been Tim Wu. There are many, but there are many critics who make that point, and I just respectfully disagree that we're dealing with a difference in kind rather than a difference in degree. But more fundamental, and John Haidt himself makes very strong arguments against many uses of screens by young people. So I certainly respect these arguments, but I think for me, even more crucial than that debate is, well, what then do we do? And I keep coming back to my conclusion based on not only a study of history, but a study of present reality under both Biden and Trump and predecessor administrations, that no matter how harmful expression on social media might be, no matter how much it goes against my libertarian and egalitarian and democratic instincts to have these tech titans wield so much power. I find that very dangerous and threatening to, as I said, individual liberty, equality, and democracy. But to me, it is less dangerous than empowering the government to decide what can be on those platforms and what cannot be. But it's this very serious argument. And I think to me, the most appealing. So let me just say, I mean, Donald Trump was the person who back in 2016 started talking about fake news, right? And then those on the left use the term disinformation. But they're basically talking about the same thing, which is whatever they consider to be information or ideas or perspectives that are inconsistent with their values and their policies. And whatever power so in the United States now, do we want to give the Trump administration the power to decide that certain fake news should not be allowed on platforms? Do we want to give that power to Elon Musk? But I will tell you, I definitely would not want that power to go to anybody, even my favorite candidate. I'm not going to disclose who that might be, because we are dealing with, so let me just say, the First Amendment law does allow, let's use the example of false speech, does appropriately, consistent with the emergency principle, allow government to punish, including on social media as well as other media, certain false speech that is intentionally false and demonstrably causes certain harm. Defamation is an example, fraud is an example, perjury is an example. But when you get beyond that to this nebulous concept of disinformation or misinformation, and look at how that's applied, it's like the term hate speech. It is inherently subjective, and it's applied on the basis of the values of whoever the enforcing authority is. And we see this not only with government, but we see it with the social media platforms themselves. If you look at what their policies on disinformation or hate speech or any of the others are, you can see that it's at best enforced in an arbitrary, capricious manner, and at worst in a discriminatory manner that is disproportionately silencing voices of those who lack political or economic power. So to me, the serious question is, what can we do affirmatively? And I think as I said earlier, we really, really, really need very strong information literacy. Then, as devil's advocate or angel's advocate, I think the strongest option that I've heard advocated for regulation that I think bears consideration, I'm not over the edge yet in supporting it, but I haven't rejected it, is the notion of common carriage, so that these platforms would be treated analogously to the railroads in the 19th century or the telegraph in the early 20th century, as being such essential infrastructure for people to communicate and participate in democratic self-government, that they should be required to give access to everybody on a non-discriminatory, fair, and equal basis. So they wouldn't be able to be selective in their content moderation. They would be treated as common carriers, not public utilities, if you will, rather than platforms such as newspapers or cable TV.
Hi, very stimulating discussion. I would just to echo the piece on social media, that I think the debate is limited because we're talking about, you're arguing, do we want to give control to Donald Trump? But we've right now have Chinese state government control. So it's not like right now it's in the hands of good and we're giving it to the government. Right now it's in the hands of a foreign entity that we know to be disruptive. We have the reports in Canada of electoral interference. So there isn't, it's not as if we're in an ideal situation. The truth is that sometimes, like, I struggle in my own head. Like, on the one hand, I'm like, I'm a free speech absolutist. And I'm like, no, we need something in order to get there. And the same thing in terms of, educating people on the limitations of these social media platforms. We don't have the medical equipment equivalent of like a blood test, a biomarker, so that people can understand the extent to which these companies are even following their express policies. I can tell you, as someone who invests in medical research for a living, that the fact checkers who operated at Google and at Facebook and in other online centers were extremely disruptive to access of information. So it wasn't just in a geopolitical environment, it related to industry as well. But I want to return to your comment on that Trump went too far in banning CRT. Because my question to you was going to be, well, is there a subject that could be banned? Like, would you argue in favor of banning eugenics, which you've already covered? Yes, that's an obvious. But I would say that we're at institutional capture with our education systems, particularly in K-12. And there are no resources. It's very sad that Stephen left, because there are no resources in any of our K-12 schools in the entire country that are a cognitive science-based approach. They are all a CRT-based approach. We have none. And so how do we get from where we are, which is complete institutional capture, to a society where we can embrace freedom of speech? Sometimes there is an interim measure needed. So, sometimes I would argue that the pendulum has to swing one way in order to come back to center. And maybe an interim effect of having a ban on CRT is that we'll then be able to cultivate those resources for our schools. Because right now, this academic or theoretical discussion that takes place on campus about oppressed oppressors is fact that is spoon-fed to young, impressionable children. That it is the vast majority of books in our kindergarten classes all the way up to K-12, and that students, when they leave school today and you tell them things like, people aren't actually arbitrarily oppressors or oppressed, they look at you with shock.
So you've made two really important points. I do briefly want to address the first one, because I think, as I indicated, there are terrible problems with the way that social media is exercising its vast power. I am absolutely no apologist for that at all. I'm deeply concerned about it. And there are a number of steps that have been advocated by those of us in the digital rights space, including the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which I know has branches in Canada as well, for many years, something called the Santa Clara Principles, which would require radical transparency. I think one of the things that you're talking about is we don't even know what their content moderation policies are, let alone voluntarily consent to them. And we don't know what algorithms they're using to decide what to feed to us. That's the antithetical to freedom of speech, which is freedom of choice. Now, we don't have any privacy protections in the United States. I know in Europe they do. I thought in Canada you do, but that's something that we've been advocating for in the United States, that, we have a right to control our personal information. It should not be subject to sweeping up by these companies, which then use that information to manipulate us and manipulate the ideas to which we're subject. So I think I'm on board with both of you about very, very serious problems. I think I'm, just reacting negatively to a potential solution of government stepping in as ultimate content moderator. On your second point, I've read that, that's going on in many schools in the United States as well. And, I go back to that first question about the survey of self-censorship here in Canada. This is a matter of the culture. How do we change the culture? And I think having government prescribe these are topics that may not be talked about, these are subjects that may not be talked about, is not going to solve the problem. First of all, it results in over censorship, at least in the United States. Rationally, teachers are just not addressing the subject at all. We've even had, no matter what your ideology is, you would be disturbed at the extent to which certain subjects are just not being taught at all, including the history of the civil rights movement in the United States. And I think none of us would support that. But the way the law is written, it's a reasonable response. You're being chilled. What we have to change is the culture in the classroom. And I was talking to Stephen, who had a class that he had to attend, so he apologized that he had to leave earlier, that I think the most important audience for my kind of advocacy in Heterodox Academy is education schools, because there's a lot of evidence that the schools in the United States are, I'm going to use the word indoctrinating. Okay, acculturating. That's a more neutral term. The teachers that they are graduating into these values and these worldviews, and they are then transmitting them to the students. Quite a few years ago now, when the book The Coddling of the American Mind came out, 2018, Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt, their hypothesis, as that of many people who are working in these fields, had assumed that woke college professors and university professors were indoctrinating their students. And to their surprise, they found no, the students are entering college with those attitudes, and the professors are being cowed by the students. So how are the students getting those attitudes? And as you say, it's starting at the earliest ages. And I think it's not coming from their parents. It's coming from their teachers.
Inte på det astronating of Edward. I thought the final summary that the greatest episode in the that head page in March. Our faculty of education of our university made us sign up in CRT. And I think that this is what this order achieves. So if I give you a discussion, it's not now.
Well, I think we share the same values, and the devil is in the details, right? We want to avoid indoctrination. We want to stimulate critical inquiry, and what is the most effective way to do that? And in the United States, at least, the term CRT is used in so many different ways to cover so many different things. And I think if we could make sure that those who are going to be teaching our young kids that's the most important audience for the heterodox values.
Hi, thank you. I'd like to follow up with a similar, because I'm also in the education and I'm really concerned about the classroom, right? I've noticed that we start having those curtailing of this freedom of speech in the classroom with first the trigger warnings and then with the safe space, and because they are all politically correct things. So what I observe is that we have this therapeutic discourse, and classrooms are not a space for therapy. So how could we start changing and expanding because there is this dominance of a discourse from the therapy. And this is coming from psychology. So how can we have a more intercultural dialogue with other disciplines and starting creating or welcoming other terms to classroom to expand it?
You know, it's interesting. Way back in the 80s or 90s, my friend and colleague Wendy Kaminer wrote a book about the therapeutic mindset and what it was doing to politics and education. And, you know, boy, she was really way ahead of her times. In today's Inside Higher Education, there was a column by two self-described progressive professors. And I'm thinking that at least one of them was in education, maybe both, one from Yale University and one from the University of Alberta. So they're transporter. And the headline was something like, why free speech is important to the left, not just libertarians. And it was a very powerful piece. I'm sorry I couldn't print it out and, you know, distribute it. But it was making so many of these points, which in the United States have been made in the recent past, mostly by people in the center or libertarians or conservatives. And because our academic institutions are so heavily tilted toward the left end of the political spectrum, you know, surveys show that the vast majority of faculty members and administrators, even more, consider themselves, you know, extreme left or very left, they have been the ones that have not seen the dangers of censorship and self-censorship. Now that, I think, is a virtue of Trump coming in and rattling his sabers, that people on the left are starting to see, oh, maybe free speech is important. And that article makes exactly the point that you make, that so many of us have been making among ourselves. But I think we're asking, how can we persuade those who are not yet on board that no matter what your values are, if you want them to succeed and you want to understand them and you want them to be enacted into public policy, then you have a stake in defending not only free speech law, but also free speech culture. And it absolutely has to start at the youngest ages for reasons that we're talking about. And we have to get back to what, you know, I'm older than most of you, but I was brought up to celebrate the opportunity that this is wonderful. This is what education is all about. You get to hear different ideas. You get to meet people who are different from you. You get to debate people. You get to change your mind. That this was not seen as a burden. It was seen as a privilege and an opportunity. And I think one of the great things about the book, The Coddling of the American Mind, I recommend it to anybody who hasn't yet read it, that is making these points not only from an educational perspective, not only from a free speech or civics perspective, but precisely from a perspective of the psychological health and well-being of young people. Jonathan Haidt, who is himself a social psychologist and cites so many others, that the record-setting levels of anxiety and depression and even suicide on the part of students in the United States is largely attributed to having been told that they are going to be suffering, that they will suffer, that they will be harmed if they hear certain words or if they're exposed to certain ideas. And even if you have the best intentions in the world of wanting to protect them and shield them and sheltering them, you're actually doing them a disservice, not only in terms of values of free speech, but in terms of their happiness, in terms of their mental health, in terms of their being able to function as human beings in a complicated pluralistic world. So I think if we can, you know, keep reinforcing that argument, appeal to what I always give people the benefit of the doubt, that those who are trying to shield students truly have the students' welfare at heart. So persuade This is the argument that has to be made to parents and teachers that no, it's really not for your child's benefit to be doing this.
Okay, so you talked about democratic self-governance. So I was wondering, do you think that surveillance through social media and over censorship sort of manifests into a broader issue of governance systems shifting towards tyranny and authoritarianism through instilling fear in public?
Can you repeat? I didn't quite understand the connection that you're drawing. It's very sophisticated.
The like surveillance and through like social media and the censorship of information, do you think that sort of instills fear in public, therefore they're sort of politically apathetic and are detached, and it sort of shifts that like governance systems towards authoritarianism?
Very interesting question. And I'm sorry I made you repeat it because I was still kind of thinking of one more point in response to your question. I mentioned the book, The Coddling of the American Mind. It has also been made into a movie, which I think I saw was available on Netflix.
Yeah, we screened it last year. It was great.
It's fantastic. It's very different from the book, which, they're two different mediums, but I think it's through the stories of 4 actual students, and you really see the suffering that they are undergoing in the name of protectionism. So to your question, it's very interesting. I'm not sure I'm equipped to answer it, but the first thing that occurs to me is that, well, no, I think I am equipped to answer it, in the sense that the kind of soft authoritarianism that we have to fear in democratic countries is chosen by the people, right? They elect leaders who then propose and enforce what I would consider to be authoritarian restrictions that repress rights that people should have. I see that impulse in the United States whenever there is actual danger or feared danger. So after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, a whole slew of surveillance measures and censorship measures went into effect that just haven't gone away. They have become part of the new normal. So to people of your age in the United States, never known anything different, that creates a different mindset, a kind of presumption that, of course, the government can search my luggage. Of course, the government can do a full body scan every time I want to come to Toronto. I mean, that used to be considered a shocking violation of privacy. I know. And so, as perceptions of what government power, the limits of government power are, expand, we can have a form of creeping authoritarianism. People are very willing to give up liberty in exchange for perceived safety, security, other perceived benefits, especially if it's mostly other people whose liberty is being sacrificed, not people like them. And those of us who advocate for individual liberty and reject these kinds of government intrusions have an uphill battle. But one of the things we have to do is to recognize that there are legitimate countervailing concerns, and we have to explain to people, no, you're giving up your liberty, but you're not really gaining any security in return. And I'm not just making this up. Security experts talk about the post 9/11 measures that we all now take for granted as security theater. It is to give people an illusion of security. It is not really doing anything meaningful to make us safer. I can give you an example from my home city of New York. There was a subway bombing in London. And so the reaction was, okay, we're going to put new surveillance provisions in effect in the New York subway system. And what those consisted of was police officers could go to any subway stop and randomly search any single person who was going onto the subway, not only you, but your possessions. But recognizing that this was completely unconstitutional, it was voluntary. So if you didn't want to be subject to search, you could just walk 5 blocks downtown and hope that there wasn't going to be a random search at that subway stop. Police admitted. How could they deny? This is completely ineffective in actually providing any real security or any deterrence. And the New York Civil Liberties Union lost the case because the judge agreed with the government's argument. It makes people feel safer. And that is enough of a countervailing benefit. So the illusion of security. And so I agree with your premise. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more.
Hi. Yeah. I just wanted to ask a question that would maybe shift the discussion in another direction. But the distinction between protected and not protected free speech, as you mentioned, is subject to the interpretation of legal documents. And in most countries, the high courts hold the authority to do this distinction. But I was wondering, as is the case of recently in Mexico, where judges are being elected by popular vote, and possibly in the U.S. with its new presidential term, that the courts might be turning political, and therefore this might yield the protection of discourses coming from dominant groups over those coming from disadvantaged groups, which moreover often fall prey to be viewed as like quote unquote aggressive, even when they are not. So my question is, I was wondering, what is your opinion as to which organism or what organisms, in plural, must be given the authority and or power to draw this line between protected and non-protected free speech? Should it be a multilateral effort?
Thank you so much. I believe very strongly in the theory that underlay the provision in the U.S. Constitution that essentially gives federal judges life tenure. They can be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors, but they may not be subject to being voted out of office because of issuing an unpopular decision. That is an essential, and the term is often used, counter-majoritarian, often in a pejorative way. You know, of course we know that the majority gets to rule. Isn't that what democracy is about? How can this counter-majoritarian of unelected 9 people, you know, and can only be 5 of them, get to turn over a law that had popular support of, you know, the whole legislature, every member of Congress and the president? And the answer is that, and this is true for Canada too, as I understand your Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that even we are not pure democracies, that there are certain rights that are so fundamental that no official can take them away from any person, no matter how unpopular that person is, no matter how strong a majority is supporting that official. And at least the courts are structured to mete out justice in accordance with the judge's best determination of what the Constitution requires. Now, there are obviously individuals who are appointed to judicial offices who may not honor that responsibility, but I believe, the structure is there for them to do that. And hopefully the advice and consent function of the United States Senate, as well as the appointing power of the president, will mostly appoint people who have those values. And let me say, in United States history, it's kind of interesting that there have been examples of people who were appointed to the Supreme Court for very political reasons, who matured and grew into the jobs and changed their perspectives and their votes. Let me give you one very dramatic example. Hugo Black, who was a United States Senator in the 30s from Alabama, at a time when we still had racial apartheid by law in that state. And he was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, as you had to be elected to political office in Alabama. And when he was nominated for the Supreme Court by Franklin Roosevelt, he was a Democrat, there was actually some opposition about his membership in the Klan. This was before we had a strong civil rights movement or a successful civil rights movement. And on the Supreme Court, he went on to become one of the greatest champions and defenders of not only free speech and other civil and political liberties, but also of equal rights and of civil rights, including for Black Americans. And one of my friends put it this way. He said, when Hugo Black was a young person, he put on white robes and scared Black people. And when he was an old person, he put on black robes and scared white people.
Well, on that note, thanks very much. Really engaging conversation. Really enjoyed it. So everyone, thank Nadine for coming from New York.